As we start this morning, I want to make a declaration to you. The Halloween season is mercifully over. Not that I have a whole lot against Halloween, it's just that it has become an unenduringly long season. I was talking with my next door neighbor the other day, and they put up Halloween lights. And I was talking with her, and she was telling me about now that it's time to change her lights to Christmas lights. Because the fact of the matter is that we tend to go from Halloween and we rush right into the Christmas season. If you don't think that's true, go to Walmart.
Or Home Depot.
Go to Home Depot.
Yeah, exactly.
That's exactly what I'm talking about. Those things are going on. And I understand that. I get excited about Christmas too. One of my favorite shops in Essex Park is the Christmas shop, and in the back of the shop they have this clock. The shop is open year-round, and that clock is a countdown clock to when Christmas happens. And I get it. I love Christmas, but something gets lost in the rush when we go straight from Halloween to Christmas thoughts. Have you ever tried to, at this time of the year, try to find a Thanksgiving-type decoration? They're tucked somewhere in there. Some of them, they said, well, we inadvertently took those with our Halloween decorations, or they're just lost. But the fact of the matter is that Thanksgiving tends to get the short end of the stick. And it tends to get rushed by. And the fact is that we really don't focus a whole lot on Thanksgiving. Not only as a day, but I believe as a concept. I mean, we believe that it's an important thing. It's one of the first words that we tend to teach our kids. We tend to teach them to say thank you. It's the basics for all of manners, and that's a good thing. But the truth is that what I really want for my kids, and what I want for us, is for us to live a lifestyle of thanksgiving. But it's easy to overlook, isn't it? I mean, we get caught in a rush all the time. Waitress brings our food to the table, and we're so busy in what we're doing or whatever's going on at our table that we forget to look them in the eye and say thanks for serving us. Or we come into these situations where we're really not exactly sure who we're supposed to thank, and so we really don't thank people like we should. Sometimes those things happen, and I think the problem is that in that type of life, when we miss Thanksgiving, we miss the blessings. We miss the blessings of the thankful life. So what we're going to do here at this church is we're going to make Thanksgiving a month-long observance, a month-long focus, and hopefully, in making it a month-long focus, it can become a lifelong perspective. Let's bow our heads and pray before we get to work. God, I thank you for giving me this opportunity in this place. Father, I pray that you would see through the sins of the servant, and that you would forgive me, and that you would use me, because you are a good and glorious God. And Father, I pray that on this day, as we look in your word, that we would allow it to penetrate our hearts and our thoughts, every part of our being, so that we can be changed, that we can be transformed into the likeness of your Son, Jesus. Father, we know that you are with us, that you are visiting with us, because we asked you to, and you said that's all we're going to do. So we stand on that promise. Father, I pray that you would work with me this morning, that the words that I would say would be beneficial and appropriate for my friends here. Not for my benefit, not even my words, but your words. Help us to make a difference today. In Jesus' name. Amen. If you are following along, if you've got your Bible or your Bible app or whatever it might be, turn that to the 17th chapter of Luke's Gospel. It's just 10 chapters past where we were last week. And turn to Luke chapter 17, and we will be dealing with verses 11 through 19 this morning, and see what he has to say there. It is a wonderful story. It is a story of the power of God. It is a story of the compassion, the incredible compassion of God. It is also a story of ingratitude. But it is also at the same time a story of great gratitude. We want to look at those things today, and so let's take a look as we go to God's Word. In the 17th chapter of Luke, it begins there with the 11th verse. Now it says this. It says, "Now on his way to Jerusalem, Jesus traveled along the border between Samaria and Galilee. And as he was going into a village, 10 men who had leprosy met him, and they stood at a distance. And they called out in a loud voice, 'Master, Jesus, Master, have pity on us.'" I want to stop right there. And I want us to think for just a second about those verses that we just read. And I wonder how many of us really know much about leprosy. Leprosy was a disease that in the first century, during the time of Jesus, it was a word that was used to describe a host of different types of diseases, most of them skin ailments. And so God had instituted years and years before that, you'll even find it in the book of Leviticus, how that people were supposed to deal with people who had leprosy. And they had to go to the priest, and a priest would go through a whole long, drawn-out, we're not going to go through all of that this morning, process of how they would be declared clean so that they could rejoin their society. But in Jesus' time, it covered several diseases, but you can tell that these particular men had the worst form of this disease, because it says, and they stood at a distance. Because if it's real, full-blown leprosy, which comes from the bacilliar bacteria, that it does some pretty unusual and strange and devastating things to the body. At its worst, where it says that they were at a distance, it looked like this. It is described as a disease that is primarily an anesthetic disease. And it usually starts out as a kind of a light-colored patch, usually on the head or face somewhere. And then it will begin to spread, because in their day they had no treatment. As a matter of fact, up until 1987, we didn't have any really good concrete treatment for leprosy. But it would start as a patch here, and then it would begin to, the boils would start to appear, the eyebrows would start to disappear, and just more and more things would take place. You'd have spots on your hand. Then you might have pain for a while. But then the anesthetic part of the disease took over, and it numbs the nerves. It destroys, it fights with the nerves. And so it's in many ways the worst of all diseases, because it fights both from the outside as well as from the inside. And the person who has leprosy doesn't know of the pain that they should be feeling, because their nerves have been numbed. And so from the inside, the disease continues on, and the flesh begins to rot and fall off. And from the outside, they don't know the pain that they're going through, and so they cause their own loss of bodily parts. This still goes on today in third world countries. It is a horrible disease. Not so much a painful disease because they cannot feel it, but it is a horrible disease because you are literally watching your body disappear in front of your own eyes. But the worst part might not even be the physical. The worst part might be the social part of it. Because the bacteria is so communicable that the lepers are pulled away from everyone else. In the time of Jesus, they had to walk around with their heads down and their hands at this point. And they had to go around telling all the world that they were unclean. And that became more and more difficult because the disease was attacking even the larynx and vocal cords. And so it made it difficult for them to speak as well. As a matter of fact, in this verse that we have in front of us, quite honestly, that's probably not a very good translation of loud voice. I was looking through that, and it's just kind of more of a voice, because probably by the time they got to Jesus, their voice was raspy and slow, and it probably took all 10 of them at one time. And they were told to stay away. They could not touch their family. They could not be around them at all. They could not touch their friends. It was the worst in many ways of all the diseases. And so people could easily see it as a physical curse, but not only that, they saw it as a divine curse. Because in the Old Testament, it had been used as a divine curse, at least on 2 occasions that we know of. Naaman the leper and Uzziah the king, God had inflicted both of those people with the disease leprosy. It was a horrible, horrible, horrible disease. I found this as I was doing my study this week. Beth Moore is a name that is familiar to probably most, if not all of you. And she writes these words. Rather than tell her story, I want her to tell her own story. And this is from her book, Jesus, the One and Only. And it says this: while I ministered in India, I was often stunned by what God empowered me to do. He seemed to raise me above my fleshly senses and allow me to minister in extreme circumstances. I was unable to do only one thing, and it has haunted me ever since. I had confidently planned to minister in a leper colony. The opportunity didn't readily arise, but after passing very close to several colonies, I deliberately did not pursue it. The reason was not unconcern. Rather, I feared I would dishonor them by becoming physically ill. You see, I almost became ill just by passing by. Nothing could have prepared me for the sight or the smell. I had been in one squalid village after another without hindrance, but the smell of the disease and decaying flesh was more than I could handle. That's the plight. That's the condition of these lepers that we addressed this morning, that you are reading there about. That is the reality of their lives, such as they are. And it is a disease that does not kill quickly. It can take a period of 20 or 30 years for a person to run the course of this disease. And generally when death comes, it's only the result of another type of bacteria or virus or something that attacks the body. Because the disease leprosy itself does not generally kill people. And so people have to live through this condition. They were sick. And these 10 lepers, they were sick and they knew it. And they recognized that they needed help. And they recognized that Jesus just might be the answer. Now I suppose an aside at that point is the fact that our problem is sometimes we're sick and we don't recognize it. We don't recognize that we are separated from a closeness to God. We don't recognize that sin ravages our lives, both inwardly and outwardly sometimes. And we fail to recognize. As a matter of fact, we think that we're okay. Society tends to tell us, you're fine, you're okay. I mean, society doesn't tell us that we have to walk around saying that I am unclean. It says we're okay, but we're not. And sometimes we need to see. Sometimes we need to see that we need healing just as much as the lepers in this story. All right, let's go on. Let's pick up at verse 14 now in chapter 11. And then when he, Jesus, when he saw them, he said, "Go show yourselves to the priests." And as they went, they were cleansed. One of them, that when he saw that he was healed, he came back praising God in a loud voice. He threw himself at Jesus' feet and thanked him.
and he was a Samaritan. And Jesus asked, were not all 10 cleansed? Where are the other 9? Has no one returned to give praise to God except this foreigner? Then he said to him, rise up and go. Your faith has made you well. Now the obvious question that we have to deal with is, what's the deal? What's up with those other 9? I mean, what's that all about? Why didn't they come back and thank Jesus? Well, the truth is the Bible never really says, so I really don't know exactly what the answer is. Maybe they got caught up in their own Christmas. Maybe they made the rush with the healing that had taken place in their lives, and they rushed to get on with their lives. Can you imagine, for the very first time possibly in their adult life, they were now able to be around their family. Maybe some of them had the disease onset in their adulthood, and they had children. And maybe for the first time, they were able to hold and to hug their kids. Maybe they were excited about these things, and they thought to themselves, you know what, I can't wait. I have to get on to this. I have to hold my family. I don't know, maybe some of them passed it off as coincidence. Or maybe some of them had seen it and they just, worst of all, had chosen not to say thank you. I mean, certainly it was no coincidence, because as far as we know, it seems like every healing of honest, genuine leprosy, the only healings were all supernatural. But do we see God's action in our own lives? And before we rush to condemn these 9 men, let's really take stock. They were really not bad men. They weren't bad. They showed some type of faith, didn't they? Even when Jesus spoke to them, they put their faith in action. Jesus said, go to the priest. And they didn't seem to balk. They believed that Jesus was a healer. And so when the healer said to them, go and show yourselves to the priest, they went. There's no hint of hesitation here. But I love this part of the story, that it was as they went that they were cleansed. Sometimes the Bible is so incredibly understated that I love the picture that it presents, and makes me understand how can you doubt that this is the truth? Because if I were writing this story, it would go something like this. And so they started along their way, and as they took their first step, the lightning bolts started to flash. And the sky began to peel back, and the angels began to sing and to sound praises to God. But it doesn't say that, it just says, as they went, they were healed. Now, it takes some faith to do that. It takes some faith to do that. And it's a lesson. That part of it, honestly, these men teach us several lessons, some good, some bad, and I suppose at this point, they teach us a very good lesson. Because isn't this the first part of faith, is when God tells us, go to the priest, that we would simply do as he has said? I mean, somewhere along the line, we may hear God speaking to us, and God may say, you know what, you need to love me despite the disease, despite the problems that you're going through. You need to obey me despite your lack of talent or your lack of resources. You need to follow me despite your depression. You need to say no to temptation while it is still difficult. We need to learn this part of the story as well. They're not all bad. They teach us many good lessons. We need to learn that as they did this, as they walked, they received a healing, but it was only a physical healing. But can you imagine as they walk, maybe they've taken 3 or 4 steps along, and the guy looks at his hand, and the back of his hand, where all of his hair, what was left, was gray and gnarly, and now it's brown and curly. And a finger that was once missing is now starting to reappear. And the limp that was once there. Well, because, it's a horrible disease because you cannot feel what's going on because your nerves are numbed. Many times they might trip on something. And they might turn an ankle and not even know that it's turned, and it only gets worse and worse and worse. All they do is compensate for their walking, and that's why people saw them. Dr. Hansen tells a story, Hansen's disease, that has now become known popularly. Tells a story about his work in India. And one day he was trying to turn the lock, or turn the key in the lock, and he couldn't make the lock turn. And finally, one young boy who was almost emaciated, was about 10 years old, came up and he quickly turned the lock and opened it. Dr. Hansen saw it, he couldn't understand what was taking place. And then he saw a drop of blood on the floor. And he said, "Show me your hand." And when the boy showed him his hand, the key had cut all the way into the bone. And it had disfigured his hand because he didn't know what it took to turn that key. But as they walked now, all of these things that once used to be wrong are no longer wrong in their bodies. And as they walk, they begin to say, maybe let's pick up our step, let's get to the priest and see what happens. And they begin the process. But the real hero of our story is the one man who in this process, as he is going, it clicks. He knew that there was something about what was happening that was real. He knew that there was more to the story. He knew that there was something more than physical healing that he needed. And so he turns back in verse 17, or 15 rather. It says, one of them, when he saw he was healed, he came back praising God in a loud voice. Maybe now for the first time, his vocal cords and his larynx had been healed because he was now well. And he could maybe for the first time in who knows how long speak out in a loud voice. And so he comes to Jesus. And at this point it is a very different word from the word that was translated earlier in their speaking. And now it is a loud, strong voice. And it's a voice of praise. And he throws himself at the feet of Jesus. And he thanks him. And he thanks him. And maybe the punchline of the story is found in the 18th verse. Has no one returned to give praise to God except this foreigner? In the Greek and the Aramaic, the word is alikanes. I'd have Sam parse it for you, but he's not here. Is not this alikanes? Alikanes is made up of two words. Ganes is the word race. Ale at this point is another. Is not the only one who's going to give praise to God except this foreigner? Is he the only one? Remember earlier it had to define him as a Samaritan. Can you imagine the beauty of all of that? Is it now the Samaritan? Because you see, when you have leprosy, you don't worry about the Jewish and Gentile and Samaritan distinction. You are all broken down and on your way to death. And the Jews and the Gentiles and the Samaritans, that's the only time that you will find them freely mixing, is when they're horribly sick. But sick they were. It's not specifically stated, but I don't think that it's much of a jump to say, were these other 9, were they Jews? And they didn't come back to thank God, but they went on to their priest. You know, sometimes in the process, in the book of Leviticus, the healing wasn't complete until you had offered some sacrifices at the temple. Had this Gentile, had this Samaritan gone to the temple, he would have walked into the outer court, and then at the edge of the outer court, he would have seen a circle with a line through it, and the word Oleganes. It's still there in every temple. Because he wasn't even allowed to go. And Jesus says, where are they? There were 9 of them, weren't there? Nine of the others, have I got this right? And they didn't come back. Just this foreigner. And it was the foreigner alone who found thanksgiving. And it was to the foreigner alone that Jesus would say, get up, on your way. Your faith is healed and saved you. I took this verse, and this verse alone, from the Message translation, because almost every other translation that you will find, even the New American Standard, translates that last part of the verse there, your faith has made you well. That is a horrible translation. Because in this passage of Scripture, there are 3 words used. There are 3 years. He was saved. In the 14th verse, you will find that they are healed. In the 15th verse, you will find that they are cleansed. 2 different words. And it's not until verse 19 that you find the word sozo, which means you are saved. I have no idea why the translators, so many translators, chose to translate it as they did, because it is absolutely clear. Because along the way, those who had shown a little bit of faith, well, they were healed physically. They were even cleansed as far as the physical remedy of their disease was, but it was only through the door of thanksgiving that this man found salvation. It was only when he realized that there is more to the person of Jesus. He is more than just a healer. They had heard about this healer because this event, in all probability, takes place not long after the raising of Lazarus. They had heard. And they trusted him, maybe even as a healer, but they wouldn't worship him as God. But this foreigner did. Because he recognized that God is a healer. Jack Hinton tells of his mission work with the Philippines, with the lepers. Dr. Hinton has ministered many years to lepers. Hinton tells of a story where one night they were at their constructed church building. And they were having a worship service on a Sunday night. And they were singing songs. And he got towards the end of the service. And he said, do we have any requests? Are there any songs that you guys really want to sing? I don't know what is going through his mind. But what would be going through my mind at that point is maybe somebody might have a song that talks about how God will take care of us, that God, we can find a way to do this through God, that maybe God will have mercy on us, and maybe one day when we die, we will go to heaven and be with got him thinking that maybe somebody would find something like that. But Hinton says, I looked at the back and I saw this hand that only had 2 fingers on it go up in the back of the road. And he said, what would you like to sing? She said, I'd like to sing, Count Your Many Blessings. Hinton says, I lost him. And he walked out to catch himself. And one of his aides went with him, and he looked at Dr. Hinton and he said, I'll bet you'll never be able to sing that song again. And he says, oh, I will sing that song every day. But now it will have a new meaning. Oh, what about us? What do we want? Do we just want the healing of the other 9? We said, you know what? We just want the stuff from you, God. We want you to bless us. We want you to take us through this, or even maybe heal us in some ways of this.